Being Reasonable comes to you from the WHUP studios in downtown Hillsborough, North Carolina.
Please fasten your seatbelts.
I'm Mark Solomon, and you are taking part in Being Reasonable, the weekly conversation show that focuses on how we've arrived on our steadfast views and our desire to know what is true. To participate in this friendly collaboration, all you need is respectfulness and an honest interest in the truth. We can all improve the way we form and consider our beliefs, and we can do so by being reasonable.
1, 2.
On this week's show, we speak with Teshin from the North Carolina Zen Center. Teshin discusses his belief in the teaching and practice of Zen Buddhism. So let's speak with Teshin from the North Carolina Zen Center. So last person I talked to about Zen Buddhism, where we had some confusion, and it was a very nice conversation, wonderful conversation. But where we struggled, it was totally on me, was she was coming from an Eastern perspective, an Eastern mindset of way of seeing things, and I am trying to interpret it through my Western lens.
Yeah.
And I totally get it. Just like it's difficult for me to just say, okay, I'm going to drop my Western lens and now I'm going to pick up this Eastern lens and kind of see how you see things. That's just impossible to do for someone who's grown up in the West. And
Sure.
But that's where we just had some difficulty understanding where each other were coming from. And it was a great conversation, but there was maybe a little bit of lack of clarity.
Well, that makes sense to me because rather than East and West, although that dichotomy is true, you could say more of a intellectual versus or rational or head-centered way of understanding versus more intuitive, direct.
Say it again, intuitive versus what?
So rather than thinking of in terms of an Eastern versus Western perspective, I would say, part of the struggle that anybody has in approaching Zen Buddhism is we come at it wanting to understand it intellectually to sort of get a handle on it. But Zen speaks to more of the intuitive side of us, and it doesn't really indulge too much in intellectual understanding. And so
What's the difference between intellectual understanding and intuitive understanding?
Well, one thing is that in Zen, we put a heavy emphasis on direct experience.
Okay.
So it would be as if the difference between, if let's say that you had never had pizza before, and I were to say to you, you said, well, what is pizza, Teshin? And I said, well, have you had bread? Yeah. Okay. Have you had spaghetti sauce? Yeah. Okay. Have you had cheese? Yeah. Okay. Now put all that together, bake it in an oven, and you can sort of approximate what a pizza tastes like. Okay. That would be an intellectual explanation of pizza. But there's no substitute for actually biting into a piece of pizza. So the difference between an intellectual understanding and a direct experience is we experience it directly rather than just talking about it or thinking about it. So in Zen, we put
So it's knowing things firsthand versus third hand.
Yes, that's a simple way of putting it. And in that way, Zen is a path, a practice rather than a set of beliefs. And so one can only really know what Zen is through the practice of Zen, if that makes sense.
What would you say is the fundamental difference between Zen Buddhism and atheism?
Well, I don't know much about atheism.
Well, atheism just as defined as a lack of belief in a deity.
Yeah, sure. In Buddhism, as well as Zen, we don't have a God concept. So there is no so-called higher power. So that there'd be a commonality between atheism and Zen.
So there's no God or deity.
That's right.
In Zen Buddhism.
In Buddhism at all. In fact, this is an important point that to mention is that it's not even an ism, really. Buddhism was a term that was invented by Western scholars but it wasn't used previous to Western scholars sort of discovering, quote unquote, Buddhism in India. So when they went to India and archaeologists saw this sort of path based around the teachings of the Buddha, they called it Buddhism, turned it into an ism. But it really originally was called the Dharma.
So was Buddha a god?
No.
No.
He was just an ordinary guy who began the path, began teaching after his own personal experience of what we call awakening or enlightenment. We don't use that word too much because it can be really misunderstood. But regardless, he had his own journey, which is a whole story in itself. But after he had his awakening experience, he began to teach his experience, and people began to listen and follow. But he's just a guy. In fact, that was often asked, "Are you he would be asked, "Are you a god? You seem different. Are you a deity? Are you a god?" And he said, "No, I am awake." And that's what Buddha means. It means awake in Sanskrit. So it's not.
So if there is an objective in Zen Buddhism or a path, it's towards wakefulness or enlightenment. Not necessarily that can be obtained, but it is the journey there.
Yes, it's both. It's the journey there. It's a path. So it's ongoing and unfolding, meaning that it really doesn't have a beginning or an end. That's one difficulty that Westerners have, that people new to Zen practice have, is understanding that it's not goal-oriented. It's not like we're going to get there and we're going to live happily ever after. Sure. But it is a path. It's an ongoing practice, and the path involves waking up more and more.
When someone is more awake, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there's two ways of looking at it. Awakening is used in modern terminology in different ways. I've heard it used lots of ways in different Buddhist traditions too. In Zen, we believe that awakening really is about realizing for ourselves that we are fundamentally not separate from everything else.
I think that would seem to align with just the simple overarching concept in physics, that everything is connected. Everything is a cause and effect. Atoms that make up you and me are not fundamentally too much different than atoms that make up trees.
Yeah.
I get that we're all part of the same soup.
Yes. So in Zen, it's not hard to sort of, especially like, as you say, with today's scientific understanding, to get there intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It doesn't take much of a leap. The difference in just understanding intellectually and experientially is that when we understand it just intellectually, it doesn't necessarily make much of a difference in our life. In other words, most of us can hear that things like, yeah, I'm one with the universe and we're all made of stardust and all these kind of nice things. But at the end of the day, we still experience ourselves mainly as isolated individuals who sort of feel hyper alone in a lot of ways. Like, we have our private thoughts, we have our struggles with anxiety, we have our struggles with, how did I find myself here?
So the self is more of an artifice.
Yeah. The self it's the experience of this self is genuine. I mean, nobody could deny that you experience yourself as an individual self. And we don't deny that in Zen, but we say that to have something to add to that, we have an experience of something greater than this individual self, something more connective. And when we experience that, again, going back to the pizza analogy, when we actually bite into that, we see it, we realize that it is fundamentally relieving in a way.
When we're talking about issues of truth, presumably when you're practicing Zen Buddhism, you're getting to some sort of universal truth, something that's real, something that says something about us. What is it about learning things experientially as opposed to intellectually that gets us to that concept?
It would be no different than taking up any path of learning. For example, I was a carpenter for many years before working as a Zen priest and therapist. As I was learning carpentry, of course, I would read books and think through problems. And And yet it was a world of difference between that and actually swinging a hammer, actually learning how to use my hands, actually learning how to handle tools and put things together.
Well, using your example,
Yeah.
what if they gave you tools and a hammer and you started doing things and you didn't have the first part?
Yeah, that's a big problem, mainly for Westerners. So for example, if you went to Japan and wanted to learn about Zen, you would simply be put, let's say, you would simply be shown into the monastery, the Zen temple, and you would just sit. And you would learn through just absorbing what other people are doing, by having conversations with your teacher, but by doing. You would learn through doing. We as Westerners usually need more than that. We usually want to have a sort of a real baseline sort of direction. Like, let me sort of get all my ducks in a row first, and then I'll begin to practice. So that's why we hold things like introductory workshops and classes and more explanatory kind of things.
But is it just as likely, if you are learning things experientially, say from other people, that you're learning something false from somebody who learned something false, who learned something false from that person, and we're not getting to anything that's true and real, we're just passing down these lenses of experiential knowing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, going back to the carpentry analogy, if your mentor teaches you experientially how to, say, build a house, and your house comes out crooked, you'll learn experientially, actually, that what you learn doesn't make sense. The Buddha said, don't believe anything I teach you just out of respect for me, but test that in the fire of your own experience. And if it works, keep doing it. And if it doesn't work, give it up. In Zen, the practice is designed to help you to experience life in a more holistic way, more peace, hopefully, more equanimity, hopefully, more groundedness, centeredness, presence. If that's not working, it's up to the student, the Zen practitioner, to then say, well, this isn't working for me. And I would never say you're doing it wrong, or that there's something wrong with the student. It's what's right for the person. So that has to be through their own.
Well, let me put the example this way then.
Yeah.
I think it's commonly accepted that the earth circles around the sun, but experientially, it doesn't seem that way. And it hasn't seemed that way for generations and generations of humans. And I'm not sure how one would know that experientially. So is there a flaw in experiential knowing, or is it just one way of knowing things?
It's certainly one way of knowing things. It's not necessarily the whole of the path in terms of Buddhism. It's primary, but certainly we value refining our understanding and being challenged in our understanding. And Buddhism is very much like science. As evidence comes to light, we take that in and change and adapt. One thing I admire about Buddhism and Buddhist practice is, as it's traveled from country to country, from society to society through time, it's adapted and changed. It lets go of sort of more cultural type of expressions of the practice, and it says, okay, recognizes these are just cultural. These are not fundamental to what the Buddha taught. We don't have, say, like a central book that says, no, this is the truth. In fact, there's a very interesting story a very short story about a conference that was held in Japan many, many, many years ago. It was sort of an interreligious dialogue, and different people of different faiths were put on stage, so to speak. And the moderator said, well, what would happen if tomorrow you found out your book was a fake? Different people said different things. It would be devastating, and we'd have to really rethink things. But the Zen Buddhist teachers said it wouldn't matter at all, because our beliefs are not out there. They come from in here, meaning inside of us. That's what's most fundamental. So
when you say beliefs that come inside us, to me, I interpret that as that these are subjective truths and not universal.
Yes. Totally. Everything, actually, that's a good point, is everything is subjective.
Everything is subjective.
There is no objective truth.
So everything is true.
Well, what you're doing is getting into a dichotomy, true versus false. True versus false.
Well, maybe we could use an example.
Yeah, sure.
So,
That'd be
for
great.
example, we have chickens in our backyard, and there are an even or odd number of chickens. There is a universal truth there. I might not know it. You might not know it, but there is an answer. And does our subjective experience of chickens have anything to do with whether there is an even or odd number of chickens?
Well, yeah, because what you're doing is you're saying, this is how many chickens I see or can find, but who knows? There may be a chicken that you haven't accounted for. This is very close to. It reminds me of.
But if there's a chicken that I haven't accounted for,
Yeah,
wouldn't that mean that we both haven't accounted for it?
I'm not following you. That we haven't both accounted for it.
Well, if there's a missing chicken, then I assume that there'd be a missing chicken for both of us, and still there'd be an answer that we could arrive to.
Yeah, we might discover that chicken later that day or later that evening, and we would just adjust for that. There would be no so
there would be a universal truth there that would still be true for both of us.
Well, again, what Zen says is that we can theorize about a universal truth. But without somebody knowing, that's an abstract concept. In other words, knowing can't exist without a knower. There's no objective truth outside of somebody that is knowing. So
are you saying that there are an even and odd number of chickens, and if we didn't exist, that there just wouldn't be an answer to that question?
Yeah, it's you're a science guy, it sounds like. You've heard of Schrodinger's cat, which is a famous physics problem, where in quantum physics, where I'm not an expert on physics, so I may get this wrong, but I guess the theoretical problem is that there's a cat inside a box, and there's some sort of cyanide pill inside that box, and if you open the lid to the box to see if the cat's alive or dead, or the cyanide will kill the cat instantly, and something like that. And the question is the cat alive or dead before you open the box? You can't know that without somebody seeing it. You can't know something without it being observed or being looked at.
So you're saying that if we didn't exist, there wouldn't be an answer to that chicken question.
That's right. Yes. Right. Because an answer implies somebody or something that an answer is actually a human construct. Truth is a human construct.
Is even and odd a human construct? Is math a human construct?
Yes.
Math is a human construct.
Yes. It does. There is no such thing as math outside of the human mind. You can't.
So if humans didn't
say,
exist, you're saying that planets wouldn't circle around, that there wouldn't be stars, that there wouldn't be gravity, that there wouldn't be functions of the universe.
I wouldn't know, because if I wasn't here to observe it, I would have no idea.
If humans, just in general.
Yeah. But what you're asking me is, would I know, or would planets still circle the sun, and would sun still circle in its whatever it's doing? Would that still happen if all of us weren't here? How would I know? Because I'm not here to observe it. So I can't know that.
Why does that require you to be here or not be here?
Because to know something means to observe it.
You may not know it, but I want to know what's true.
Yeah, that's a good question. I just don't know. So
and why take that position that if I'm not here, then this doesn't exist? Why, a priori, it would seem that the default position would be, if I'm not here, this all continues to go on.
Yeah, just to reorient us, the honest truth is I don't know, because I've never experienced that.
Okay.
And Zen, that's where we get back to Zen. Zen doesn't value too much philosophical speculation about things like this, because in the end, we don't know.
But this seems like a really central question.
Yeah.
Because this really gets to the nature of reality. If reality occurs inside our head, something inside me, or if reality occurs outside of my head and I'm just interpreting whatever that reality is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it seems like you're saying that reality is inside our head and we can interpret it pretty much in any way we desire.
Well, I think that really what we're talking about is whether this notion of inside versus outside. This goes to the fundamental experience of what Zen awakening is to see beyond duality of inside outside, truth versus non-truth. That all these dualities that we sort of get caught in actually cause a lot of our suffering.
But if there is no duality, and I get that, then there would be no fundamental difference between inside, outside. And
Yes.
that would imply a universal truth, I think, as opposed to individual subjective truths, no?
Yeah, in Zen, we would say there's really no difference between those two. The absolute, as we talk about it in Zen, and the relative. The absolute, you could say, is the sort of universal, and the relative is my individual experience of that, is experience of the world, is in fundamentally not two different things. They're not two different things. It's when we start splitting off and saying, there's that out there and there's this in here. That's what the Buddha recognized as why we suffer, because we experience ourselves as separate from the world. We experience these things as separate and therefore grasp onto things, notions like truth. We go after things like, I want to know what the truth is. And then in that process, we create suffering for ourselves.
Well, maybe instead of using the word true, just we could substitute the word real.
Yeah. Again, real is what's real for you is certainly what's is different from what's real for me.
So everything is true, because I could say what's real for me is that there's 5-foot chickens roaming around my yard, and that's real for me, and
Yes.
you're not seeing it, and that's not real for you.
Right.
But
Yeah.
everything is real.
Yeah. Again, this is the relative. That's from the relative side of things that there's, or the subjective side of things. Sure. Yeah. We're not interested. See, this is the thing that I want to sort of get us out of in this conversation, if I'm allowed to, is that Zen isn't interested in.
So this is something that concerns you.
Yeah, it's not a part of. We're not after some sort of philosophical truth or reality.
Right.
What we're interested in is relieving people's sense of suffering and pain in the world, and how best do we do that? So the Buddha never
So you
made
can
any
relieve pain and suffering, and I think I get this, by means that have nothing to do with reality, nothing to do whether it is true.
That's right.
And if I believe that there are stacks of gold bullion in my closet, and I've never checked, but I believe it, and it makes me feel good, then I'm on the path.
Well, I don't know if that would be on the Buddhist path, but if rather than on the path, if that's not a problem for you, then who am I to sort of intervene and say, if you're not causing harm to others, if you're not causing harm to yourself, who am I to say that that's something you shouldn't believe in? Again, the Buddha never made any philosophical claims about the universe. He simply said, I teach two things. I teach suffering and the end of suffering. So he said, if you want to learn about how to relieve suffering, then I have something to say, basically. And here's the path to follow as I've discovered it. He didn't say this is the only way. He didn't say that this is the right way. He just said, this is the practice that I've discovered. And again, try it. And if it works for you, fine.
So if I were to ask you on a scale, let's say from 1 to 7, how important is truth to you?
Yeah.
You would be pretty low on that scale?
Well, I don't spend my days contemplating truth.
It's just not something you think about.
Not so much. I'm in the business of doing what I can to share with people how to center themselves, ground themselves, to become more present with the people in their lives, and to become more available, both emotionally, physically, and mentally.
Well, this is, an important question, and
Yeah.
it gets to a premise of the show. Personally speaking, truth is important to me. If it's true, I want to know it, and I want to believe it or think it.
Yeah.
If it's not true, I'd rather not spend my time on it. And that's a personal preference. And I can see arguments where that is helpful to humankind, in the sense that if we are all walking around with our own belief systems that are wildly different and at times even diametrically opposed to each other, one could see how that could get us into trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you're saying is that as long as the belief system is useful, it's not harmful,
Yes.
that we're all good.
Yeah. I mean, obviously to me anyway, there are cases where belief systems do cause harm. There's even in this country, in this modern day, there are many people that deny basic science. That
But it sounds like, to be a Zen Buddhist, you could deny basic science and be just fine with that, because that's just a belief that you're interpreting.
as again, as the where Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism, it comes from the Mahayana tradition, and part of the Mahayana tradition is we have this ideal called the Bodhisattva, and the Bodhisattva is a person or a being who postpone their own full enlightenment to help others. So it's an ideal. It's not meant to be taken literally but it's we believe that helping others is fundamental. Actually, it's actually at the core of what human beings are. We're meant to take care of others, and so when we have beliefs, or when we enact beliefs through our actions that are harmful to other people, for example, denying science and then perhaps crafting policies that end up harming other people, then we would have a problem with that. That's not to say that we don't get more information as we develop, as science develops it. But the beautiful thing about science, as going back to an earlier part of our conversation today, Mark, is it's very similar to Buddhism, is that it has no problem with revising its own stance as more information comes to light. And I think that's the most fundamental similarity between Buddhist practice and modern science.
One of the fundamental aspects of science, as I understand it, is that science has a way of checking itself.
Yes.
That if you are on the wrong path, so to speak, and that path is incorrect, there are ways built into the system to discover that that's incorrect. In your practice, what ways are built in for you to discover that if what you're practicing is incorrect, that you could discover that?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the Zen tradition, we put an importance on the teacher-student relationship. So having guides or mentors that can share their experience with us, and to help sort of correct, or to at least question, if not correct, but at least help us question where we find ourselves, our beliefs, our practices, is because we recognize that Zen is kind of an apprenticeship model in a lot of ways. It's so easy to sort of take a practice like Zen and just read about it, and then take it up and believe that we're doing it in a way that's going to be helpful. But as we know, we have infinite ways of fooling ourselves.
Well, right. So with the apprentice model, I could see getting at aspects that are closer and closer to what is helpful.
Right.
Where I see science getting at closer and closer to what is true.
Yeah, they're not absolute equivalents. Again, science is science and Zen practice is Zen practice. They're not equivalents. What they have in common, I think, is that questioning, that sort of desire to ask, is this working? Is this in Zen's case, is this helpful? Is this working? Is this helping? And so it revises based on that. And I think science does the same kind of thing in a different way, different objective perhaps, but it's not afraid to revise its hypotheses and to test those. And so Buddhism does the same thing.
And I apologize for my Western mind here, but
well, that's the only mind you have. So.
Right. But a confusing aspect maybe of Buddhism is that if it's not working, that it can be revised, and then that is Buddhism. And if that's not working, then that can be revised or changed.
Yeah.
Then that is Buddhism.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it's not disconfirming in the sense that, well, whatever I want it to be, it is. And whatever I don't want it to be, that it's that too. And then that can apply to future things, and that can apply to things that have happened in the past. And so if it's something that's so murky, it's just everything and nothing. Mm-hmm. Am I wrong?
Well, there are certain core principles of Buddhism that I think no matter how the container looks, would be pretty fundamental to what we would call the Dharma. The Buddha recognized that all things are impermanent. There is no fixed thing. Even the most solid of things we know changes.
Okay, so if you were to encounter in your life with good evidence this thing, this entity, object, whatever, with good evidence, sufficient evidence for you that this thing exists, has existed this way, has always existed this way, and it will exist this way in the future, then you wouldn't practice Buddhism.
Well, I would just incorporate that into my understanding.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Otherwise, I would be foolish.
Because you're saying a central tenet of Buddhism is that things are always changing, but then if that wasn't the case, you still practice Buddhism, but you would just change that tenet.
That would be what I would do. You know, the Buddha talked about this analogy. I'm sure you've heard it, Mark, the analogy of the elephant, which is quite common these days. But he said, imagine 5 blind people that approach an elephant, and each one of them touches a different part of the elephant and comes to know what that elephant is through their experience. And one touches the leg and thinks it's a pillar. One touches the trunk and thinks the elephant's a snake. One touches the ear and thinks it's a palm leaf.
Right.
And so the Buddha said that that's akin to the way we understand the world, that we don't claim to have a full understanding of it, but each one of us has a piece of it.
Yes, we might not have a full understanding of it.
Right.
But there is a universal truth that there is an elephant.
There is an elephant. The goal is to get as close to that as possible. But again, in Zen terms, is why are we doing this? It's not just
why are we touching the elephant?
Why are we trying to understand the elephant? Why? In Zen terms, it's to again relieve suffering, to become more peaceful in our own life, or however you might say it. But it's not to just simply do it philosophically. We don't have that. Might be of interest personally to some people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in terms of a Buddhist path, the part of the reason that we do suffer is because we pursue things that are sort of working against our own personal freedom. And so one of those ways in Zen that we recognize, in fact, this goes back to the Buddha's time himself. The Buddha's cousin, Ananda, was highly intellectual. And we're told, again, this is all speculation, but we're told he was very highly intellectual. And In fact, he was the reason we know the Buddhist discourses is because he remembered. It was an oral tradition at that time, you understand, and so he remembered all of what the Buddha taught, and so that's why we understand what we do. But because of that intellectual understanding, he had a hard time actually practicing and waking up, having an awakening experience, because his intellect, as powerful and helpful as it was at some point got in his own way because it kind of tripped him up. And so Zen is not anti-intellectual, but it does recognize the limits of the intellect. It says, well, the intellect is fine when it's applied in certain areas of life, like you say, calculating the path of planets or making financial decisions that are important for ourselves or other people. That's important to employ the intellect. But when it comes to relieving our own suffering and finding happiness, sometimes the intellect actually gets in the way. Not all the time, but oftentimes it actually becomes a barrier to our own happiness.
Let me ask you this question to help me understand. If we're sitting out here on this deck and we're talking, and hopefully this doesn't happen, but I all of a sudden pass away. I really hope that doesn't happen, but
Me too.
It could.
Me too.
If that happened to me, would you go along existing, or would you not exist anymore?
You mean the person that passed away? You mean...
Would you go along existing? Would you exist in this world after I pass?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Would I continue? Would I get up out of this chair and eventually move on with my life?
Yeah, would you just go along living your life? Would you live after I died?
As far as I know, I would. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm assuming I would. I don't see why I wouldn't. I'm not sure. Help me understand your question.
Well, if everything is tied to the experience and I no longer experienced you, it's impossible for me to experience you because I've died.
Yeah.
But you go on, wouldn't that suggest that subjective realities are irrelevant to what is true? That makes sense? I can try to rephrase that.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
I think you're telling me that everything is tied to the experience. In my example, I'm hopefully demonstrating how the experience could be seen as irrelevant.
Irrelevant.
Right. Because you go along experiencing reality regardless to what happens to my reality.
Okay, I get you. So here's my answer. I would say that I wouldn't simply go on without my experience changing because of your passing away. My experience would fundamentally change, or maybe not fundamentally, but it would certainly be altered by, and we in Buddhism recognize that everything we experience changes our reality.
But my example hopefully gets to the idea of like math and the planets moving around, that whether I lived or not, if I passed away, those planets would continue to circle.
Sure. Yes.
And if you passed away, math would still work and those planets would still exist. But
Yeah, sure.
I think you're telling me that math happens inside our head, that it wouldn't happen.
Math is a human construct. It's an idea. It's a way of describing reality. It's a language.
Doesn't it work whether we
Yes.
can describe it or not?
Yes, but that's not math. That's
not math.
So when I say, for example, I love my wife, that's a description of an experience. It's a very limited description because what you have in mind and what I have in mind in terms of what love means is different. But so math is a language that describes the way the planets work or the way apple drops from a tree, and it's a description, but it's not the thing itself. And that's fundamental to Zen, is knowing that language is important. Languages like math or languages like any kind of language, any kind of description can be important. But where we get into trouble in Zen terms is believing that the language is the thing itself.
So what is math describing?
Well, it's describing, like I said, it's just, and I'm not a mathematician, so I want everybody listening to this to understand I'm not trying to speak outside of my knowledge base.
Yeah.
Math is describing events that we see and experience, and it describes weight. It describes other concepts like that, dimensions, movement, and
So math is descriptions of other objects and movements.
Yeah.
Are those objects and movements governed by math?
no,
No.
not the way I see it. Math is simply description. It's a shorthand. It's shorthand for what we experience or what we can predict we will experience. But it's shorthand. It's not the thing itself. That math is simply a word. Math. That's a word. It's a concept. It doesn't.
What if I said that math is the thing itself?
Sure. I mean, certainly math has its own integrity. I mean, if I'm doing a math problem.
What if I just said, I'm not saying this is the case, but what if I just said it's just all math? It's just math is the fundamental root. It's not the language, it is the thing.
Okay. I don't know. I don't have an
Okay.
opinion about that, unfortunately.
I'm just
Again,
trying to-
I'm
I'm
not
really trying to understand how I'm not trying to I'm really not trying to argue with you. I'm not. I'm really trying to understand how you see things.
Uh-huh.
And it's my limited brain. I apologize.
Well, if you're trying to understand Zen, why we're talking, practice in Zen belief is that these things, concepts like math or the way we describe things, have value, and but they're not the whole picture. And so just like the elephant, it's not the whole picture. And so we want to recognize the limitations of things like that. Certainly math, knowing math, again, does not describe the human heart. It doesn't get at the longing that we feel or the anxiety we feel. It doesn't get at the bond between mother and child and things like that. And so,
And I'm not saying that's easily discoverable,
Yes.
but those aspects of the world are not governed by math or physics. That's just that's governed by a different system, you're telling me.
well, I don't know if I don't know that it's useful to try to find that system.
I'm not saying it's discoverable,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to understand that is that just functioning off of different rules, or does that still fall in the realm of functioning within the scope of physics and math and how we understand things to function?
Yeah. It's part of what science has done is go down the path of reductionism. It tries to get a handle on everything it can. It tries to reduce things to its most basic parts so that it can understand things.
And I'm not trying to reduce. What I'm saying is that it might not be reducible,
Right.
in that sense, but is it still functioning under the same rules as other experiences or objects, or is it a different sauce? Is it a different animal that just math and science and physics it'll never be able to get there because it just doesn't have whatever that structure is needed?
Yeah. There is a limit to, as my opinion is that there's a limit to limit to languages, models like math and science. There are limits to that. I don't know what those limits are, but there are limits, and those what I mean by that is that right now there are limits. Like, we can't know certain things. Will we in the future? I'm sure. We keep pushing back the boundaries of what we know. What 20 years ago was not knowable, in a lot of cases is knowable now. But we have to acknowledge that it's a sort of a progression or a discovery process that's happening. And so we acknowledge that that there's limits to what we can know now. You couldn't have invented a car in ancient Egypt not because there was not the fundamental languages or the fundamental knowledge wasn't there, but you just didn't have the preceding steps that were met. So you needed to know how to all the basics go into car designing, and even thinking that a car is possible was not possible in ancient Egypt.
Yes. And to use your example, in ancient Egypt, people probably couldn't even begin to imagine the concept of a car.
That's what I mean.
Couldn't
yes.
even put their head around it.
Yes.
Now cars exist, but the thing about cars is that cars still function in a cause and effect universe. And there's physics that can explain how cars work. And so that's still inside the notion of how the universe works and what is true from a universal perspective.
Yeah.
I think the difference is what you're telling me is that you have a way of knowing that is outside that.
I'm not making any claims about
that is outside math and science, and a way of knowing that is what is possible in the sense of being able to build a car.
Yeah, it's not outside of it. It's just it includes it. It's just nothing is outside. There is no inside or outside, so to speak. There's nothing that is outside. Again, this is where we kind of go down these rabbit holes of dichotomy, which are pretty unhelpful in terms of Zen practice, because we get tripped up with right and wrong, truth and non-truth, and things like that. And what we're trying to do is show our students, show Zen practitioners, have them experience for themselves something that is not subject to inside or outside.
And I do think I follow you in the sense that, and please tell me if this is not what you're saying, but we can discuss things as being simultaneously helpful and unhelpful, and we can simultaneously discuss things as being true and not true.
Yeah.
And we can discuss things as simultaneously being, you name it.
Yeah.
And I think I understand that concept. To me, in the end, I'm asking whether that just creates a great number of distinctions with no differences, right?
A great number of distinctions.
A great number of distinctions with no differences. In other words, we can describe how certain things are distinct from this thing and certain things are distinct from that thing, but there's really no difference between things. And so it kind of shuts down the conversation, right?
Not in terms of Zen practice, it doesn't. The job of a Zen student is to simultaneously see and understand the universal, the non-distinctive, or the world of non-distinction, but not in that process, not abandon distinctions, not abandon individuality, relativity. This is a very hard thing to understand. Within the universal, within the absolute, is the relative. That within the relative is the absolute. There is no difference, actually, between the relative and absolute. They are two sides of the same coin. So on a ruler, you'd see that, on the front side is all the numerals and all the markings on a ruler. But if you flip it over, there's no markings, no distinctions, but it's the same ruler. It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Zen practice is seeing those at the same time. It's about understanding that at the same time. Part of the problem is we get into is, again, the dualities of, well, if I see the universal, then relative truth is out the window. Or if I simply focus on subjective and relative truth, then universal truth must be out the window. But that's, again, dichotomous thinking. And dichotomous thinking is, from a Zen Buddhist point of view, part of the problem.
And I think I understand the pitfalls of dichotomous thinking, but could there be scenarios where a universal truth that someone holds makes the personal truth, whatever that is, impossible to hold, and vice versa. That it just wouldn't make sense.
Could you give me an example, maybe? Just so I always work best.
Yeah.
I have a hard time because I'm not philosophically trained, by the way. I'm not, I didn't go to school for
Sure.
philosophy. So I have a hard time.
No. We'll just use the example that we used. You have a personal truth that there are an even number of chickens, but the universal truth is that there are an odd number of chickens. Those are, you can call it dichotomous thinking, but I'm trying to understand how both could be true.
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty simple. The experience that you're having of whatever your count is, say 7 chickens, that's your experience, is true to you.
If it's true to you,
it's true to you. So it's a truth
are
to
things
you.
that are true to you true?
To you, they are, yes.
But are they true? Are they factually correct?
Yeah. There, again, we're keep kind of going in circles here, but there is no, from a Zen point of view, there's no truth outside of human experience because.
So everything is true.
Yes, to one degree or another, yes. It doesn't mean that we don't revise those truths as we get more information, but this kind of thing, these kind of philosophical debates, the kind we're having, which I'm not that skilled in, honestly. The Buddha had this happen all the time, and many Zen masters over the years have had this happen.
Hopefully this is not a debate.
No.
Yeah.
A conversation, philosophical conversation. What the Buddha always pointed us back to was, what's the objective of the question? Like, why are we asking these questions? That's what we want to understand, is what's the point? Because the Buddhist path is, again, simply about relieving suffering. And so when we sort of go down philosophical paths, we want to be clear about what the point is. Is that going to help us get to relieving suffering? He said it's like a man who's been shot by an arrow, and the arrow is stuck in the man, and somebody comes over and says, "Hold still, I'll pull the arrow out." And the man says, "No, don't pull it out yet. First I need to know who shot the arrow. I need to know what feathers are on the end of the arrow. I need to know what wood it was made out of, etc., etc." Meanwhile, he's in pain and suffering, and he's asking all these questions. So the Buddha said, this is like what he said it's called the second arrow problem. We're in pain and suffering, and yet we don't relieve that. We actually make it worse for ourselves by asking all these questions that don't get to the point of relieving suffering. So it's not that these questions that you're asking are unimportant to some people. It's just not the realm of Buddhist practice. It'd be like asking a doctor about how to ride a motorcycle. It just wouldn't be as relevant. It's sort of outside of the expertise or outside of the realm of that doctor. So the Buddha was called a physician. He was trying to.
But if you are asking a doctor to relieve suffering,
yeah,
of a malady, and that's hopefully what doctors do.
Well, sometimes.
What are they going to rely on to do that?
Well, they're going to rely on their training. They're going to rely on their
based
training.
on what?
Well, it's a combination. Obviously, their schooling, their experience, their the research of other people. So, yeah.
But wouldn't it be based on universal truths in the sense that how science works and how the human body works and how illnesses work and germ theory and you name it?
Yeah, that would be a big component of it. The additional part would be the human component. We all have been to the doctor and have felt, or at least I have, and I know many people have felt that despite their knowledge base, that there's a sort of feeling that, at least in modern medicine, that there's kind of like I've got to get to my next patient.
I get it. And they might not be good doctors and they may not know certain things. They might have gaps in their knowledge, But does that, again, speak to the reality of how universal truths or science or would work in those scenarios?
Yeah, but to a certain extent, but what one patient needs, another patient may not need. So
Mm-hmm.
the medicine has to suit the illness.
Sure.
And so that's
But
where
could there be science that would account for that too?
maybe, I imagine, I'm fascinated by these days, Mark, is AI and the learning that
Mm-hmm.
happens in AI and how quickly it can learn. It can see things.
Mm-hmm.
The algorithms can learn things that humans would otherwise take decades, if not centuries, to learn.
Sure.
I'm fascinated by that.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I'm sure given enough information, you could account for all of that. We don't have that right now, so there is a certain amount of intuition and a certain amount of going off of experience and the experience of others that can be helpful. Aside from just sort of scientific book knowledge and learning, you to the kind of care that comes through a physician when they hold the hand of a patient who's very ill. We know um, that can be very helpful and very healing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, is that science? I guess ultimately you could say, well, science might begin to try to study that and account for that. Uh, but I would say that's traditionally wouldn't be the realm of science. That would be the realm of the heart. Now, I think what you're asking is that outside of science or is there some sort of universal? Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe again, given centuries and centuries more, maybe we'll begin to incorporate more of that into our knowledge base and, um, you know, but some of that has just to be learned through direct experience, not through formulas or through just through experience of working with patient after patient after patient. And you could say, well, that's science too, because you're just getting more information, you're revising the way you work with people, and you're taking that into account. And I think the problem would be is if you didn't take that into account and you just continued what you were doing without revising how you care for your patients.
Last question.
Okay.
From your perspective, I think you might agree that we live in a difficult time.
Yes.
From a Zen Buddhist perspective, what could we be doing as a country that we're not doing to make things more whole and less contentious?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think one of the most important things that we can do is recognize the divisiveness inside of ourselves. We tend to blame the other guy and say, they're the one who is being divisive. They're the one who sees things wrong. They're the one who has the problem. From a Buddhist point of view, we want to recognize that suffering arises in our own minds. It comes from that very notion of the problem is out there. It's with the other person. It's with the party. That sets into motion a great amount of suffering in our own minds. Part of the solution would be to recognize our own role in things in creating a divisive world. How we do that moment to moment, in the way we interact with people, the way we reinforce division, surrounding ourselves with only people that we agree with, not learning to tolerate and stretch ourselves. All these things are practices in Buddhism, and I challenge my students all the time to put that into place in their own life, to recognize their own role. It's not a blaming kind of thing, but it is taking responsibility, that it's not somebody else's responsibility, it's my responsibility. How that looks for each individual is going to be different, but inaction, that doesn't really help. If anything, the reason that we practice Zen is not to understand some fundamental truth, it's to reduce suffering in the world. And so if any of my students, if I see them sort of experience them as just practicing meditation, but not actually enacting that in their life, not taking it out into the world and doing good with it, it's useless. And so that's what I think we need to do more and more.
From the WHUP studios in downtown Hillsborough, North Carolina, I'm Mark Solomon, and you've just listened to another episode of Being Reasonable. Questions? Thoughts? Connect with us at beingreasonableshow.com. See you next week.